Los Angeles. A closed Hollywood party at the end of the 1960s. The kind with no photographers, no schedules, no witnesses anyone would ever admit to. Around the table sit actors who've won too much to be careful, producers who decide careers between drinks, journalists pretending they're just friends tonight. Glasses are refilled without asking. Jokes sharpen as the night deepens. In this room, laughter isn't kindness, it's dominance. Robert Mitchum leans back, relaxed, already half smiling before he speaks. He's known for it, the dry edge, the casual contempt, the way he dismisses singers who wandered into movies as if they were props that learned to talk. He throws the line toward Dean Martin. It lands clean. Polite words, clever phrasing, nothing crude. The kind of joke you're supposed to laugh at. And everyone does. The meaning, though, is unmistakable. About talent, about discipline, about the carefully maintained image of a man who hides behind alcohol and charm, about not being taken seriously. The table erupts, chairs creak, someone slaps the wood. Approval ripples outward. Dean doesn't laugh, he doesn't answer. He sits still, eyes lowered to the table, as if the joke never reached him. For a few seconds, the laughter keeps going on its own, louder than necessary. Then Dean lifts his gaze. No smile, no irritation, no need to rush. And in that instant, the temperature of the room changes so sharply that even the waiters feel it, though none of them could later explain why. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The room had no name on the invitation, only an address and a time. That was how these evenings worked in old Hollywood. A rented hillside house, curtains drawn before sunset, valet parking handled by men who never asked questions. Laughter here was currency. A quick line could raise your stock. A slow one could cost you the next call. The crowd leaned older, seasoned. Producers with loosened ties, studio lawyers pretending not to listen, actors who had learned to survive by speaking first and loudest. Jokes weren't told to amuse. They were thrown, tested, measured for effect. Whoever controlled the room controlled the night. Robert Mitchum held court near the bar, glass resting heavy in his hand. He didn't push himself forward. People drifted to him on their own. He had that reputation. Sharp mind, sharper tongue. A man who never apologized for the bruise if the punch landed clean. His humor wasn't crude. It was precise. He liked his targets polished. Dean Martin stood a few steps away, angled slightly toward the window. Not hiding. Not presenting either. He wore the familiar uniform, tailored suit, relaxed posture, the look of someone who didn't need to prove he belonged. To most in the room, he was exactly what the magazines sold every week. Charming, unserious, a man who floated through success on timing and a glass always half full. Mitchum's voice cut through a pocket of laughter. He didn't raise it. He never did. "You know," he said, turning his eyes toward Dean without fully facing him, "every group needs a lucky charm. Something familiar, comfortable, even better if it looks a little drunk, keeps expectations low." The line was elegant, too elegant to call out. A few people laughed instantly, reflexively. Others hesitated, scanning faces, recalibrating. Someone near the back exhaled a quiet, nervous breath. Dean didn't move. The pause stretched longer than etiquette allowed. Long enough for a producer to shift his weight. Long enough for a journalist to lower his glass halfway to his mouth. Someone murmured, barely audible, "He's gone a step too far." Dean's eyes lifted. Not to Mitchum. Not yet. He looked around the room, unhurried, as if counting exits. Faces met his gaze and dropped away. In that silence, it became clear. He wasn't searching for words. He was reading the temperature, measuring who needed the laugh, who needed the tension, who needed nothing at all. Mitchum waited. He was used to counters, used to sparring. But Dean didn't smile. He didn't shrug. He didn't reach for the easy deflection everyone expected. His stillness settled over the room like a held breath. The kind that makes people uncomfortable not because something happened, but because it didn't. A man near the bar whispered to no one in particular, "That's not offense. That's control." Dean finally raised his head fully. His expression hadn't hardened. If anything, it was clearer now, calm, deliberate, untouched by the punchline that had been thrown his way. He didn't speak. And for the first time that night, no one else did either. The silence didn't break when someone laughed again. It broke when conversations restarted in fragments, slightly off rhythm, like an orchestra that had lost its conductor. People spoke more quietly now. Words were chosen with care, as if the room itself had begun listening. Someone near the fireplace leaned toward a casting director and said, not unkindly, "They're nothing alike, those two." It wasn't a defense. It was an observation that had waited years to be spoken out loud. Mitchum had built his presence on friction. Everyone in Hollywood knew it, even those who pretended not to. He came alive on resistance, against studios, against scripts, against expectations. He wore his disregard like armor. When he mocked the business, it was convincing, because part of him truly despised it. The rules, the fake smiles, the endless calculations. He showed up late, left early, and dared anyone to call him on it. That defiance fed the legend. Dean's reputation traveled a different route. He was discussed in lighter tones, a man who never seemed pressed. Someone once joked he treated work like a hobby that accidentally paid very well. The image stuck because Dean never bothered to correct it. He arrived on time, hit his marks, knew everyone's name, and then stepped back, letting others believe whatever version of him made them comfortable. A producer, older now, whispered to a screenwriter, "You know he saved that picture in '58. Came in, did the scene in one take when everyone else was frozen." The screenwriter raised an eyebrow. Why didn't anyone hear about it? The producer smiled thinly. Because he didn't need them to. Across the room, Mitchum sensed the shift before he understood it. He was used to rooms leaning toward him, not away. Used to people laughing even when they weren't sure why. Tonight, something had slipped. Not dramatically, subtly. Like a card turned face down when he wasn't looking. Dean listened more than he spoke. That had always been the difference. He let people underestimate him because underestimation created space. Space to move. Space to decide. Space to walk out of a mess without fingerprints. Where Mitchum burned bridges for honesty, Dean simply never stepped onto them. A studio publicist murmured, "Mitchum hates the circus. Dean mastered it." The word hate lingered. It explained more than the joke ever could. Mitchum's line hadn't been random. It carried years of irritation. Not at Dean's image, but at how effortlessly he wore it. How he could survive inside the machine without letting it grind him down. The room began to piece it together. The pause earlier hadn't been shock. It had been recognition. Dean wasn't slow because he was empty. He was quiet because he was choosing. Mitchum took a drink that didn't seem to satisfy him. He glanced once, briefly, toward Dean. Their eyes didn't meet. But something registered. The sense that he had aimed at a caricature and struck something solid underneath. No one announced the realization. It passed between people in looks, in lowered voices, in the sudden care with which Dean Martin's name was spoken. Not with reverence, with recalibration. The tension didn't leave the room. It settled. And beneath it lay an unspoken truth. This wasn't a clash of egos. It was the collision of two ways of surviving the same unforgiving place. Dean's voice didn't rise to claim the room. It arrived the way certain decisions do, already made before anyone noticed the moment begin. "I've been lucky," he said. That alone shifted the air. No punchline, no defensive curl. Just a statement, plain enough to disarm the instinct to interrupt. A few heads turned fully now, glasses paused halfway up. Mitchum angled his body at last, not confrontational, just alert. "I've been lucky with timing," Dean continued, his tone steady, almost conversational. "With people who covered for me when I didn't deserve it. And with the kind of work that lets a man hide if he wants to." There was no self-pity in it. If anything, the admission landed heavier because it refused drama. He wasn't correcting the joke. He was stepping past it. Actors in the room recognized the maneuver immediately. This wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reframing. Dean wasn't talking about rat packs or reputations. He was talking about the invisible agreements that kept everyone employed. The favors, the quiet rescues, the days when someone showed up prepared so another didn't fall apart. "We all lean on something," he said. "Some of us lean on the work. Some on the noise around it." A brief pause, not for effect, to let the words settle. None of that lasts forever. Mitchum's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. Dean hadn't named him, yet every line traced close enough to feel personal. The room waited for the turn, the soft insult wrapped in courtesy that everyone expected. It never came. Dean nodded once, almost to himself. "I know what I look like," he added, "and I'm fine with it." That was the line that cut deepest, not because it stung, but because it removed the target entirely. By owning the caricature, Dean left no opening for it to be used against him. The tension didn't snap. It drained slowly, leaving behind something heavier. Awareness. Someone near the back shifted their feet, uneasy. A laugh tried to start and died halfway through. Mitchum studied Dean now with a focus he usually reserved for scripts he respected. He'd come expecting deflection or charm. He got neither. Dean's last words were quieter than the rest. Almost private, though the room heard them. "We're all playing something," he said. "The trick is knowing when it stops being useful." Silence followed. Not the brittle kind that begs to be filled, but the thick, reflective kind that resists interruption. Mitchum took a breath he hadn't planned on. He understood then what he'd misjudged. This wasn't a man wounded by a joke. It was a man who had decided, calmly, not to trade in that currency. Dean didn't wait for approval. He didn't scan the room again. He simply let the moment stand on its own, then reached for his glass, as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. But something had. The joke was no longer the center of the evening. Neither was the man who'd told it. The shape of the conflict had changed, and everyone in the room felt it, even if no one yet knew what would come next. The party didn't end. That was the strange part. Music resumed at a careful volume, conversations reassembled themselves in smaller knots, and waiters kept moving, as if the evening had followed its intended course. Yet the rhythm was gone. Whatever had held the room together before now existed only as habit. Dean moved easily through it, unhurried, stopping when someone spoke to him, listening more than answering. He asked questions about other people's projects, their families, the small details that made the talk feel normal again. No one mentioned the joke. No one needed to. The absence of it hung between sentences like a missing note. Mitchum stayed near the bar. He didn't hold court anymore. He drank without enthusiasm, staring past the glass instead of into it. A director he'd known for years approached him, then thought better of it and veered away at the last moment. Mitchum noticed. That unsettled him more than any open challenge would have. Across the room, two producers spoke in low tones. "It wasn't what Dean said," one murmured. "It was what he didn't." The other nodded. "Most men would have gone for blood. He didn't need to." A veteran actor, someone whose name had once meant more than it did now, leaned against a wall and watched Dean with new attention. "He's always been like that," he said to no one in particular. "Shows up ready. Doesn't talk about it. Lets everyone else think they're sharper." There was no praise in his voice, just acknowledgement. Mitchum felt the shift pressing in. He was used to aftermaths that involved raised voices or forced reconciliation. This was different. No one circled him. No one asked if he was all right. The room hadn't turned against him, but it had turned quiet in a way that left no space for dominance. He glanced toward Dean again. Dean was laughing softly with a studio accountant, of all people. His body angled away from the center, as if he'd already stepped outside the moment that still trapped others. There was no victory on his face, no satisfaction. That absence irritated Mitchum more than a smirk ever could. A screenwriter drifted close to Mitchum and said cautiously, "You know, people remember who keeps their footing." It wasn't advice. It was an observation, delivered without malice. Mitchum gave a thin nod, but the words lodged anyway. As the night wore on, people began to leave in ones and twos. Coats were collected. Goodbyes were brief. The earlier laughter felt distant now, like something that had happened in another room. Mitchum stayed longer than he intended. He watched Dean cross the space toward the exit, stopping to thank the host, shaking a hand, exchanging a few final words. For a moment, Mitchum considered approaching him. The impulse surprised him. He let it pass. Dean stepped out into the night without looking back. The door closed softly behind him. Mitchum remained where he was, glass untouched, staring at the place Dean had stood seconds before. The joke had ended hours ago. What lingered now was something else entirely. An unfamiliar weight, settling in slowly, with no obvious way to set it down. The house was nearly empty when Mitchum finally moved. Chairs stood where people had left them, slightly askew, as if the room itself were tired of holding shape. Someone had turned off the music without ceremony. The night pressed in through the windows, quiet and unremarkable. Dean was near the hallway, waiting for his coat. No entourage, no lingering audience, just a man ready to leave. Mitchum approached without a drink in his hand. That alone made the moment different. His steps were unhurried, but not casual. He stopped a few feet away, far enough to keep the exchange private, close enough that retreat would be obvious. "I don't usually miss," Mitchum said. Dean looked at him, attentive, neutral. He didn't smile. He didn't stiffen. He simply waited. "That line earlier," Mitchum continued, choosing the words carefully, "it wasn't about you." A pause followed, then a quiet correction. "Not only about you." Dean nodded once, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "I get tired," Mitchum said, "of walking into rooms where everyone's expecting the same man." He exhaled, the sound more controlled than relieved. "So I give them what they came for." Dean slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "That's efficient," he said, not unkindly. Mitchum almost laughed. He didn't. "You make it look easier," he said instead. Dean considered that. "It is," he replied, "once you stop fighting what they think they see." The hallway light hummed softly above them. No one passed. No one interrupted. This wasn't an apology, and both men understood that. It was something less comfortable and more honest. "They think I don't care," Dean went on, "that I drift. Let them. It keeps the doors open and the expectations low." He met Mitchum's eyes briefly. "Gives me room to decide who I actually want to be." Mitchum absorbed that in silence. For years, he'd treated sharpness as survival. Watching Dean choose softness, not as surrender, but as strategy, unsettled him. "I didn't see that," Mitchum admitted. Dean shrugged lightly. "Most don't." The admission sat between them without demand. Mitchum glanced toward the empty room, then back. "I'm not good at playing anything else," he said. "You don't have to tonight," Dean answered. That was all. No handshake. No closing line meant for retelling. Dean took his coat from the rack and turned toward the door. Mitchum stepped aside without thinking, making space. As Dean left, Mitchum remained in the hallway, listening to the door close, feeling the quiet settle in. The balance between them hadn't resolved. It had shifted, unstable, unfinished, but real. For the first time in a long while, Mitchum didn't know which version of himself would walk into the next room. The set was already behind schedule when the tension surfaced. Not the dramatic kind that drew attention, but the creeping sort that tightened shoulders and shortened tempers. Lights burned hot. Assistants whispered into headsets. A line producer checked his watch for the 5th time in a minute. Dean arrived early, as he always did, and took in the scene without comment. Mitchum stood near the monitors, jacket off, irritation barely contained. He hated delays, hated the small failures that reminded him how fragile control really was. It started with a mistake no one planned for. A young production assistant, new, eager, visibly out of his depth, mixed up a cue. A camera rolled too late. A moment was lost, not fatal, but expensive. The reaction came fast. "For God's sake," Mitchum said, not shouting, but sharp enough to cut. "This isn't amateur hour." The assistant froze, his face drained of color. He tried to speak, failed, nodded instead. Everyone nearby felt it. That familiar calculation of blame, the silent agreement to let the weakest absorb the hit so the machine could move on. Dean watched the exchange unfold from a few steps away. He didn't intervene immediately. He waited long enough to be sure this wasn't theater, long enough to see the kid's hands start to shake. "That one's on me," Dean said. The words weren't loud. They didn't demand attention. But they carried. Heads turned. The line producer looked up sharply. Mitchum frowned, not offended, just confused. "You weren't near the camera," Mitchum said. Dean walked closer, placing himself between the assistant and the center of the set, without making a point of it. "Still my call," he replied. "I should have checked the cue before we rolled." It wasn't true. Everyone knew it. That was the point. The assistant stared at Dean, startled, unsure whether to accept the lifeline. Dean didn't look at him. He kept his focus on the producers, steady and unyielding. "We can reset in 5, Dean added. "No harm done." The crew moved, grateful for permission. Someone clapped once, reflexively, then stopped. The moment passed almost unnoticed, swallowed by logistics and motion. Almost. Mitchum stayed where he was, watching. He'd seen men protect themselves before. He'd seen favors traded, credit shifted. This was different. Dean hadn't gained anything. No leverage, no applause. Just a quieter set, and a young man still employed. As the assistant slipped past, Dean leaned in slightly and said, low enough that no one else heard, "Next time, check twice. You'll be fine." That was it. No reassurance beyond what was necessary. They rolled again. The scene landed clean. Work resumed. Later, Mitchum found himself replaying the moment, the ease of it, the lack of performance. Dean hadn't stepped in as a star. He'd stepped in as a professional who understood the cost of fear better than most. For the first time since the party, Mitchum felt the joke return to him, not as embarrassment, but as clarity. He hadn't aimed at a mask. He'd aimed past the man entirely. And this time, there was nothing ironic left to hide behind. Time passed in the way it always did after moments that mattered, quietly, without ceremony. No headlines followed, no stories circulated. Hollywood moved on, as it always had, toward the next urgency. The bar was nearly empty when it happened. Not one of the places people went to be seen, but a narrow room just off the studio lot, dimly lit, its walls carrying decades of unremarkable conversations. Crew members drifted in and out after long days. No one paid much attention to who sat where. Dean was already there, jacket folded beside him, a glass untouched in front. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He rarely did. Mitchum arrived later. He paused at the entrance, scanning the room out of habit, then spotted Dean at the far end. For a moment, he considered turning back. Old instincts surfaced, avoidance dressed up as independence. He ignored them. He didn't sit beside Dean. He took the stool one seat away. Close enough to acknowledge. Far enough to keep it simple. The bartender glanced at Mitchum. "Same?" Mitchum nodded. Then, after a beat, added, "Put it on his tab." He didn't gesture. He didn't look at Dean when he said it. The bartender hesitated, then complied. Dean noticed. He turned his head slightly, just enough to register the act. No smile crossed his face. No comment followed. He lifted his glass in a small, almost imperceptible motion. Not a toast, not a thanks. An acceptance. They sat like that for a while. Two men sharing space without filling it. The low hum of the room did the talking for them. After a minute, Mitchum spoke. Not to explain, not to reopen anything. "You didn't have to do that back there," he said. Dean answered without turning fully. "I know." That was all. The weight Mitchum had carried since the party eased, not because it was resolved, but because it no longer needed words. He understood now what he'd missed before. Strength that didn't announce itself. Authority that didn't demand recognition. The kind that left no story behind, only an impression that stayed. Dean finished his drink and stood. He slipped on his jacket, nodded once in Mitchum's direction, no warmth added, none withheld, and headed for the door. Mitchum watched him go. He didn't call out. He didn't reach for another line. He let the moment remain what it was. Private, unrepeatable, honest. As the door closed behind Dean, Mitchum stayed seated, staring into the glass in front of him. Not searching for irony, not rehearsing wit. Just sitting with the quiet understanding that some men never needed the room to bend toward them. They simply knew when to leave it behind. And for the first time, Mitchum watched someone walk away without needing the last word.